Feliz jueves a todos. Happy Thursday, everyone. Muchas gracias por este.
You were muted now, Maria Luisa. Somehow we stopped hearing you.
Muchas gracias. I think the host may have muted me. Pues este evento será bilingüe con interpretación simultánea en inglés y español. This will be a bilingual event with simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. Si usted no es bilingüe en estos dos lenguajes, por favor siga estas instrucciones para activar su función de interpretación. If you're not bilingual in these two languages, please follow these instructions to activate your interpretation feature. Si está conectando desde una computadora, presione sobre el icono de globo al pie de su pantalla y luego haga clic sobre su lenguaje preferido. If you're connecting using a computer, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and then click on your preferred language. Si está conectando desde un teléfono inteligente o tableta, presione sobre 3 puntitos al pie de su pantalla a mano derecha y luego presione sobre interpretación del lenguaje. Para finalizar, presione Done. If you're connecting from a smartphone or a tablet, click on the 3 dots in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Then click on Language Interpretation. Then select your preferred language. To finish, click Done. When choosing your language, you will see an option to mute original audio. Select this option to hear only the voice of the interpreter. To hear the original audio simultaneously, you may leave it unmuted, and you can change your selection at any time. Al elegir su idioma, verá una opción para silenciar el audio original. Seleccione esta opción para escuchar solo la voz del intérprete. Para escuchar el audio original simultáneamente, puede dejarlo sin silenciar y puede cambiar su selección en cualquier momento. Al final de esta introducción, su canal comenzará a funcionar. Mantenga la función de interpretación encendida durante el resto del evento. At the end of this introduction, your channel will start working. Keep the interpretation function on for the remainder of the event. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, interpreters. My name is Nara Milanish. I want to welcome everyone. I'm the director of CEMECA, the Center for Mexico and Central America, which is a space for thinking about, through, and with the region at Columbia University. First of all, I would like to thank our interpreters. I would like to thank our panelists for being with us here today. I'd like to thank the CEMECA staff for helping us make sure this event goes off without a hitch. As you might all imagine, doing simultaneous interpretation on Zoom remains a challenge. So I would like to in particular thank the interpreters. Momentarily, we will be putting those instructions in the chat so that in case you didn't understand anything, you will be able to remember which link to press and which icon to choose in order to select your language. So first of all, I would like to thank Professor Maria Inclán, who has organized this panel. Organizing panels, cross-national remote panels is truly an act of academic generosity. So I'd like to thank her very much for her work. Maria is a political scientist, a professor and researcher at the Centro de Investigaciones y Docencia Económicas in Mexico City. She specializes in comparative social movements and processes of democratization, and she will be our host momentarily. So this panel responds to an urgent issue in the hemisphere and indeed in the world, challenges to academic freedom. We have witnessed a proliferation of illiberal challenges to free speech, to free inquiry. We witness fake news, attacks on expertise, the demonization of whole fields of academic study and investigation. So this panel offers an opportunity to think through some of those challenges, as well as to explore possibilities for solidarity across different national contexts. I want to remind all of our panelists to please speak slowly, as I am trying to model, as you present your work in order to facilitate the translation of our interpreters, not to mention the comprehension of our listeners. So please speak slowly, please breathe. And once again, I would like to thank Professor Inclán, and I will pass the rectangle to her now.
Thank you so much, Nara. Good afternoon to all seminar participants and attendees. It is a great honor for me to be here moderating this event. I am most grateful to Professor Nara Milanic and the Center for Mexican and Central American Studies at Columbia University Institute for Latin American Studies, and for so graciously welcoming the proposal to organize this seminar or this event. The goal of this event is to raise awareness and build solidarity around recent and increasing threats against academic freedom in the hemisphere. History has taught us that threats against academic freedom and attacks against academic communities are the first authoritarian signs of sitting governments who do not tolerate criticism. Bring critical thinking essential to academic communities, and being intellectuals, academics, and scientists, those who can offer evidence based on critical analysis to government and public policy decisions, they become the first targets of rulers with authoritarian tendencies. Hence, attacks on academic freedom always raise alarms of further potential democratic backsliding. The 4 cases my colleagues will present to you today illustrate the very different contexts in which academic communities have been under attack. They exemplify the great political spectrum which populist authoritarians may come from. They also speak about the common feature that unite their actions: intolerance to critical thinking and academic freedom as one of the many forms that free expressions can take. Dan Smith, who is professor and chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Florida, will present to us the case of censorship and repression that 3 political science professors have been suffering since they were barred from testifying as expert witnesses in voting rights lawsuit against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' administration, as they had done so in the past. Kath Andrews, professor of history and former academic provost at CIDE in Mexico, will describe the harassment that the academic community in Mexico has experienced since the beginning of the López Obrador's administration, but in particular the harassment against CIDE and its members since the illegal and illegitimate imposition of the center's new director by the National Council of Science and Technology. Amparo Marroquín, professor at the Department of Communication and Culture at the Central American University in El Salvador, will narrate to us the impositions on the academic community under the populist leadership of Nayib Bukele. And finally, the most extreme case of attacks against academics and academic freedom comes from a member of the Central American University in Nicaragua, who needs to remain anonymous to protect their identity, freedom, and life. The order in which our panelists will present today will be the same as the one that I have followed to introduce them. And so without further ado, I cede the floor to my colleagues, trusting their moving narratives will help us build the necessary transnational solidarity to confront this common threat. Each will present in their language of choice, as Emeka so graciously provided us with translation support into both languages, English and Spanish. And after their individual presentations, we may have time for a session of Q&As. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Inclán. Thank you, Center for Mexico and Central American and the Institute for Latin American Studies and Columbia University. My name is Daniel Smith. I am a professor and chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Florida. Next fall will be my 30th year as a faculty member, the last 19 at the University of Florida. Being on the faculty at UF has been a joy. We have really smart undergraduate and graduate students, many hailing from Florida, a top-notch Latin American studies program that brings in brilliant students from across Central and South America. Our students are not jaded. They have little pretense. Those who want to get an Ivy League education can do so at UF, and I have been very fortunate to be able to train these fabulous students. My teaching, research, and service to the community has always been driven with this goal of mine of benefiting people's daily lives outside the classroom. UF has a stated goal that it exists to share the benefits of its research and knowledge to the public good. Like many academics at colleges and universities in the United States, I have always taken academic freedom for granted. I've never really thought too much about it. Perhaps that's a privilege of my race, my gender, my advancing age. From my undergraduate days, protesting apartheid in South Africa at Penn State University, to my grad school days at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, fighting for better benefits for teaching assistants, to my pre-tenure days in Colorado, speaking publicly and freely to the state legislature and to the press about the pros and cons of direct democracy. I've never thought twice about opining on issues on which I've studied and published. When I'm asked to profess, whether speaking to the media, talking with a group or organization, or testifying in a court of law as an expert, I try to present dispassionately the academic scholarship on the topic and the findings of my research. Of course, when I serve as an expert witness in litigation, whether hired by plaintiffs or the state, I'm by definition well-versed on the topic that I've been asked to serve. I've been repeatedly asked by plaintiffs, as well as the state of Florida, to analyze and come to conclusions about laws dealing with voting and election. My audience is the court itself, typically a state or federal judge. The same is true for my colleagues at the University of Florida, Professors Sharon Austin and Mike McDonald. We're regularly asked to serve as experts in lawsuits because we are experts in our field. When serving as experts, we use methods that are reliable and appropriate in the discipline of political science, and our opinions result from applying these methods to answer the questions we've been asked to address in the litigation. Over the years, I've served as an expert in roughly 36 voting rights cases, most of them dealing with voting rights in Florida. My opinions and testimony have never been found to be unreliable by any court, federal or state. In fact, they have led to significant victories for plaintiffs, the citizens of Florida, as well as the state of Florida. The University of Florida, my employer, knows all of this. They know that I and my colleagues are experts in our field. We always report our outside activities, and UF regularly celebrates and highlights our activities. Sharon, Mike, and I generate immense free publicity to UF every time we write an op-ed, are quoted in the New York Times, Washington Post, or appear on national television or radio shows. Until recently, the administration recognized and celebrated our outside activities. Indeed, my annual evaluations from my dean praise my research and my advocacy on voting rights for the citizens of Florida. The three of us are now embroiled in a federal lawsuit. We are suing the University of Florida for denying our ability to engage in outside activities, specifically serving as experts in a voting rights lawsuit in Florida. UF's rationale to deny us is that because UF is a state actor, litigation against the state is adverse to UF's interests. Restrictions on academic freedom, be it in a public or a legal forum, can only harm a university's reputation. Indeed, a top 5 public university, such as UF, faculty should be expected to be called upon to profess their expertise to the public. regardless of the content of their speech. Restrictions on academic freedom, on the right or the left, are abhorrent, anathema to the notion of a liberal education. One might even argue that institutions of higher learning should expect their faculty to provide expertise, particularly if it challenges preferred viewpoints of political authorities. Restrictions on academic freedom are a reason why democracies may die. When institutions of higher learning accede to the will of political authorities, who is left to stand up and call truth to power? As Hannah Arendt noted in The Origins of Totalitarianism, the consistent persecution of every higher form of intellectual activity by the new mass leaders springs more from their natural resentment against everything they cannot understand. Total domination does not allow for free initiative in any field of life, for any activity that is not entirely predictable. Totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies, with those crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is still the best guarantee of their loyalty. I was honestly stunned when UF informed me that outside activities that may create a conflict of interest for the Florida State Executive creates a conflict for the University of Florida. The disapproval I received from the central administration perplexed me. Besides always approving my previous outside activities as an expert, how did the administration even know that what I was going to opine would be against the interests of the state of Florida? When you're hired as an expert in a lawsuit, you do not know what you are going to conclude until you dig through the evidence. Do your empirical research, just as you would as a scholar. And your findings must be informed by the prevailing academic scholarship. I can't go into any of the details of our lawsuit against UF or the voting rights litigation, although we did have a massive victory from a federal judge in January, as they are still being appealed before this federal court. But to conclude, as Sharon and Mike and I wrote in an op-ed in the Washington Post in early November, after we heard about the disapproval, according to UF's mission statement, the university heralds itself as an institution that, quote, strives to foster a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment for all students, employees, partners, and visitors. And as political science professors, each of us teaches, writes, and speaks every day on issues voting and democracy. For years, our expertise has been valued by our employer, the University of Florida. That's how it should be, but apparently it's no longer the case at the University of Florida. UF's actions, including its revised outside activities policy, remains an unconstitutional prior restraint on our speech. It is causing an undeniable chill among faculty, non-tenured and tenured alike. It is leading to the self-censorship of political views and opinions by experts who Floridians should most expect to speak up. Shouldn't the University of Florida be pleased with our efforts to examine whether voting discrimination exists in Florida? Shouldn't they want expertise of their faculty who they hired, promoted, and have celebrated, speak out on public issues? After all, the cornerstone of UF's own mission statement is to share the benefits of its research and knowledge for the public good. Sharon, Mike, and I remain resolute in our effort to continue to promote our employer's admirable mission. And again, I am humbled to be asked to participate on this panel with individuals who are facing much greater risks than we are. Thank you again, Dr. Inclán, for inviting me.
Thank you, Dan. Now we give the floor to Kath Andrews.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Kath Andrews, Professor of History at CINE, the Center for Economic Teaching and Research in Mexico City. I'm a colleague of Maria's. I'm going to speak about the current situation in Mexico, and in particular about attacks on academic freedom in my own institution. The election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador as President of Mexico in 2018 has brought ideological arguments not seen since the early 20th century back into the debate around the role of higher education in Mexican society. The revolutionary governments of the 1920s and the 1930s wanted socialism to be the defining feature of public education. They believed that dialectic materialism was a scientific methodology which allowed students to correctly analyze the social, economic, and political movements that they were living in. As a result, they lobbied for the adoption of socialist education as the framework for state, school, and public university curricula. In this context, universities pushed to gain autonomy, that's to say independence, in matters of curricula and appointments. If we fast forward nearly a century to President López Obrador, he interprets the Mexican democratic transition of the 1980s and the 90s as a perversion of these revolutionary ideals. A close reading of his speeches since 2018 shows that he often underscores the role that academics have played in this transition with considerable rancor. For him, they are the principal architects and beneficiaries of neoliberal economic reforms enacted by governments since 1982. As such, he argues that academic life is one of undeserved privilege, huge financial reward, and little relevant service to the public good. As he is a politician who has always disliked criticism, he also rejects academic research, which does not support his policies or political statements. From his point of view, all criticism of his actions comes from privileged minorities, like academics, who are defending their own selfish interests. From this perspective, the proper role for academics working in public institutions such as CIVE is that of producing research that will support his policies in the first place, and to educate Mexico's young people in such a way as they will want to ally themselves to his political party, the National Regeneration Movement, known as Morena in Spanish. As a result, López Obrador believes that academic institutions need to be reformed to root out privilege and force them to work for the public good. Their research and teaching priorities need to be refocused so that they contribute to his government's goals. And above all, academics should refrain from criticizing him or his government. This is evidenced, for example, in the bill for a new science and technology law, which proposes that the government should establish a state agenda and impose these research priorities on public higher education institutes at all levels. Similarly, the National Science and Technology Council, or CONACYT, which oversees scholarships, fellowships, research grants, among other things, has been reorganizing its distribution of scholarships and research grants around 10 national problems, or PRONASs. All postgraduate degrees that receive funding from CONACYT, all research grants, must demonstrate their commitment to one or more of these problems. This policy has led to a more than 50% reduction in postgraduate grants being awarded. The reduction is even greater at an undergraduate level. This year, the Secretary of Education has not awarded a single maintenance grant or travel grant to undergraduate students. Finally, the government abolished the trust funds, or fideicomisos, which undergirded public institutions' finances and allowed them to administer grants from public institutions, NGOs, and other private sources. This makes institutions of higher education completely dependent on tax money and thus on the government's whims. López Obrador's policy towards higher education centers has been clearly demonstrated by his recent overt interference in the designation of a new general director or rector at the Center for Research and Teaching Economics, where I'm a professor and served as academic provost until November last year. Here, the candidate favored by the director of CONACYT and the president was imposed on the center in a designation process which openly flouted the center's bylaws and procedures. To justify this attack, supporters of CONACYT and the president denounced the CIDE as an institution of self-interested academics whose research and teaching only serve private interests. They hope that the new director will force the recalcitrant professors and students to abandon their neoliberal inclinations and make its research and teaching program more palatable to López Obrador and his party. As the new director admitted to me and others, part of this plan is to create a hostile environment which will lead to the departure of most of the current academic staff. These professorships will then be awarded to people allied to Morena. Another example of the present government's attitude towards academics and academic freedom are to be seen in the relationship between the Director General of CONACYT, Dr. Maria Elena Alvarez Bulla, and the current Attorney General, Alejandro Gertz Manero. The Attorney General has been rector at the University of the Americas, a private institution in Mexico City, since 1995. In this role, he has tried to be appointed to the prestigious National System of Researchers, or SNI, which CONACYT administers on numerous occasions. Gaining this appointment requires the candidate to prove his academic qualifications and contributions to a committee made up of his peers. Before 2018, Gertz Manero was consistently refused entry as he was unable to demonstrate the requisite academic production. In fact, one committee observed that he had committed plagiarism in some of his work. After 2018, in May 2021 to be precise, Gertz Manero was awarded the highest distinction in the system by an ad hoc committee named by Alvarez Bulla. When academics protested and pointed out his plagiarism, Alvarez Bulla convened a special session of CONACYT's Ethics Committee, inviting only 3 of the 6 members. This committee ruled a few weeks ago that no charge of plagiarism could be brought against Gertz Manero because the authors of the works in question he allegedly copied had made no complaint. The authors in question have been dead for several decades. Also in 2021, the Attorney General's office opened investigation into Alvarez Bulla's predecessor as Director General of CONACYT and 30 other academics on the charge of organized crime. For full disclosure, it should be pointed out that 4 of these professors, including the ex-director Enrique Cabrero, are faculty at CIDE. The charges related to financial support CONACYT awarded to the Science and Technology Consulting Forum, which had been created by the Science and Technology Law, and these grants were administered during Cabrero's tenure. The law was reformed in 2020 to remove this body and to terminate CONACYT's obligation to award its financing. The Attorney General wishes to retrospectively apply this reform and to argue that the monies paid to the forum constitute illegal payments. He charged that the 31 indicted professors had worked together in CONACYT to authorize, process, and pay these resources, and thus they had participated in organized crime. In Mexico, an accusation of organized crime allows the authorities to freeze all the accused's assets and imposes mandatory imprisonment until the case is concluded. Thus far, 2 judges have refused to accept the charges as presented by the Attorney General, citing the 14th article of Mexico's Constitution, which does not permit the retrospective application of the law. However, just a few weeks ago, Gertz Manero has insisted his investigation remains open and that the charges will not be dropped. Also, as rector of the Americas University in Mexico City, Gertz Manero has an interest in his institution's sister university in Puebla. the University of the Americas Puebla, or ULAP. In fact, Getz Manero has maintained a legal injunction against ULAP, which prevents it from using his university's logo and branding since 2010. And currently, the ULAP is embroiled in a legal battle over the management of trust funds which finance its activities. It's called the Mary Street Jenkins Foundation. The disagreement derives from the expulsion of Guillermo Jenkins de Landa from this foundation in 2013 and his subsequent legal bid to wrest control of this trust from the rest of the Jenkins family. Before 2018, this suit didn't prosper, but after Getz Manero became Attorney General in 2018, Jenkins de Landa suddenly became lucky. Thus, in 2021, in April, a judge ruled preliminarily in favor of him, and thus the Morena governor of Puebla, Miguel Barbosa, ordered the occupation of the university campus in San Andres Cholula by state police. As a result of this action, Armando Rios Pite was declared rector of the ULAP, deposing the former rector Luis Ernesto de Rez, and in August, warrants were issued for the arrest of Derbez, as well as the vice rector's administration and finance, and the director of legal affairs at ULAP for embezzlement. Warrants were also issued for the lawyers representing their cases. Tribunals have overturned these judicial actions and ruled that the original management should remain in control of foundation. This happened in the autumn of last year. However, it wasn't until February that the state police retired from the Cholula campus, allowing staff and students to return. In short, López Obrador's government has a hostile attitude to academics and academic institutions. Attacks on academic freedom and university autonomy are being carried out in the name of anti-corruption, and academic communities are being stigmatized and persecuted for their alleged opposition to the government. In this way, Mexico's situation is comparable to those faced by other academic communities, both within Latin America and in Europe, where academic freedom is similarly under threat from authoritarian regimes. We must unite our voices in defense of academic freedom everywhere for the good of academics and academic institutions, but above all, because academic freedom is the best antidote to authoritarianism dictatorship. I'd like to thank the Center for Mexican and Central American Studies and Columbia University and the Institute for Latin American Studies for the invitation to participate in this forum. And I'd like to particularly thank Maria Inclán for all her efforts in organizing the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Kat, so much. Vamos a pasar ahora a la presentación de Amparo Marroquín.
Muchas gracias. Yo voy a presentar un esquema en la pantalla mientras voy leyendo. Bueno, empiezo saludando a todos mis compañeros de panel. Es realmente un honor estar acá junto con gente que ha tenido este tipo de señalamientos. Yo voy a hacer un trabajo un poco menos personal y más macro. Y quiero agradecer también particularmente a María por la invitación a poder compartir lo que El Salvador está viviendo. Nunca ha sido fácil hacer trabajo e investigación intelectual en El Salvador, en Centroamérica en general. Y hacerla como Edward Said nos dijo que deberíamos hacerla, como exiliados, como aficionados que saben mucho sobre su particular campo de estudio y como autores de un lenguaje que se esfuerza por decirle la verdad al poder. Esto es, en las propias palabras de Said, alguien que rehúye a volverse un escriba, que empuja a todo el mundo y que se vuelve vocero de la fidelidad del Estado. El Salvador ha tenido una larguísima lista de presidentes y políticos de turno que han exigido a los intelectuales fidelidad. No es sencillo hacer academia en un país como El Salvador. La academia salvadoreña se ha constituido desde la periferia, sin casi ninguna inversión del Estado que ha priorizado, entre otras instituciones, aquellas vinculadas a la seguridad nacional. La policía y el ejército, por ejemplo, recibirán este mes un refuerzo presupuestario de 80 millones de dólares. La Universidad de El Salvador, la única universidad pública, en cambio, inició el año con un recorte de 12 millones en su presupuesto anual. Es muy posible que quienes escuchan nuestra discusión hayan utilizado datos sobre El Salvador para ilustrar o entender fenómenos como las migraciones o la violencia, pero es muy poco probable que hayan citado algún académico salvadoreño, pues la producción que tenemos es todavía muy incipiente. Más allá de los planteamientos que he hecho, que no son nada novedosos, es posible afirmar que el contexto político actual ha fragilizado la libertad de pensamiento y la capacidad de ejercitar la investigación y el pensamiento crítico. La postura gubernamental hacia el trabajo intelectual posibilita cada vez más la autocensura y persigue a través de distintas estrategias a cualquiera que cuestione los planteamientos centrales que emanan de la presidencia. Veamos algunos hitos de la realidad salvadoreña de los últimos años. En enero de 2017, como alcalde de San Salvador, la capital, Nayib Bukele prohibió la entrada de algunos periodistas a una conferencia de prensa alegando que el medio desinformaba sobre su gestión como alcalde. Un gesto pequeño pero muy ilustrativo. En junio de 2019, Bukele llegó a la presidencia. Algunos días después tuiteó su famosa frase, Drácaris, mientras ordenaba despedir a funcionarios a quienes señalaba por estar emparentados con el presidente anterior o sus ministros, mientras, a su vez, construía sus propias redes de poder entre sus familiares y amigos. 8 meses después, el 9 de febrero del 2020, se tomó militarmente del Congreso y amedrentó de forma pública a los diputados por no hacer exactamente lo que él pedía en el momento. A partir de ahí, una serie de decisiones fortalecieron el accionar del ejército y le permitieron cada vez mayores prerrogativas. Poco más de un año después, el 1 de mayo de 2021, con una mayoría absoluta en el Congreso, la diputada Suezi Callejas tuiteó Drácaris de nuevo. Y tras una solicitud que se aprobó de forma rápida, el Congreso destituyó a la Corte Suprema de Justicia y al fiscal general para nombrar a funcionarios favorables al régimen. A partir de ese momento, el presidente Bukele tuvo el control de los 3 poderes del Estado. El pasado 3 de febrero, una comisión que investiga actos de corrupción llamó al rector de mi universidad, la UCA, Andreu Oliva, para ser interrogado por ser parte de un proyecto de formación de docentes a nivel nacional. El último hecho que quiero dejar anotado en esta línea de tiempo que estoy presentando es el repunte de violencia del sábado 26 de marzo, que se convirtió en el día más violento del siglo XXI para la historia de El Salvador. 62 asesinatos en distintos puntos del país, que llevó al presidente a decretar estado de excepción y suspensión de garantías constitucionales. Esto quiere decir que en este momento, si el Estado considera por alguna razón que soy una persona sospechosa, puede arrestarme sin explicación y sin derecho a defensa. A lo largo de todo este periodo y de forma sistemática, el gobierno ha colocado información en reserva y ha restado capacidades al Instituto de Acceso a la Información Pública. Una de las últimas acciones ha sido poner bajo reserva la información sobre remesas recibidas con la billetera de Bitcoin. ¿Cómo hacer investigación y pensamiento crítico en estas circunstancias? El pasado martes 5 por la noche, el Congreso aprobó penas de hasta 15 años a, cito, cualquier manifestación escrita que haga alusión a pandillas y que reproduzca y transmita cualquier tipo de mensaje originado o presuntamente originado por dichos grupos. Estas afirmaciones ponen en riesgo a los colegas que investigan temas vinculados a seguridad en un país en donde entender el modus operandi de las pandillas es un componente fundamental para comprender lo que sucede con el tejido social. Me detengo en la UCA, mi universidad, una institución jesuita con 9,000 estudiantes, 28 programas de grado, 18 maestrías y 2 doctorados, con más de 500 académicos de tiempo completo que hacen investigación, docencia y proyección social, con una historia de pensamiento crítico contra los sectores poderosos que llevó a que 6 jesuitas y 2 colaboradoras fueran asesinados por el ejército en noviembre de 1989, durante la Guerra Civil. Esta misma institución ha sido señalada por el Congreso con el hashtag ONG Fachada, mientras los troles, como pueden observar en las dos publicaciones siguientes, atacan el papel de la universidad y de su rector. César Faguaga, presidente de la Asociación Nacional de Periodistas de El Salvador, ha señalado que podemos afirmar claramente que en El Salvador está bajo ataque la libertad de expresión y que el periodismo y el pensamiento crítico están en riesgo. Los ataques han crecido de forma exponencial. Comenzaron con bloqueos a conferencias de prensa y han continuado con la negativa de funcionarios a rendir cualquier tipo de cuentas. Esto ha evolucionado en un discurso de odio. La APES ha identificado 4 momentos contra la libertad de expresión o 4 acciones concretas. La primera, estigmatización y discurso de odio. La segunda, bloqueo sistemático a la labor periodística, pero también a todo tipo de contraloría independiente. La tercera, el uso institucional del Estado contra la prensa y el pensamiento crítico, en especial acoso a periodistas mujeres. Y cuarto, la etapa actual, mordaza y represión. Como un dato añadido, y ya con esto voy cerrando, la periodista Loida Velar publicó un reportaje que señala que al menos 50 personas salieron de El Salvador en el último año por persecución política. Seguimientos y órdenes judiciales antecedieron la huida de estas personas. En el caso de las mujeres, pandilleros les hicieron amenazas directas, según los últimos datos recabados por las organizaciones de la sociedad civil. La persecución política se ha sumado a la violencia y a la pobreza como causa para huir de este país centroamericano. Si me permiten, quiero aprovechar este momento para hacer un no tan secreto homenaje a las y los salvadoreños que mientras hablamos están cruzando fronteras o haciendo planes y maletas que los obligan a dejar su país y su familia en nuevas circunstancias sin saber en qué momento van a regresar. ¿Qué tanta libertad tenemos? Hay un riesgo inminente, me parece a mí, en un país extremadamente violento, el país de los 62 asesinados en un solo día, cuando un presidente alienta la irrelevancia del pensamiento independiente, del periodismo investigativo y de cualquier tipo de cuestionamiento, tachándolo como mera oposición pagada y sin sentido. Quiero cerrar con un poco de optimismo. Muchas personas nos han dicho que el rol de la academia es el de la integridad y la coherencia. Si la UCA y otras instituciones académicas e investigadores han podido señalar y analizar la situación que vivimos, es porque también se ha hecho lo mismo con muchos otros regímenes a lo largo de una historia de autoritarismos locales y de intervencionismos extranjeros. Tenemos que seguir visibilizando lo que pasa y también debemos mantener las redes y cuidados necesarios para iluminar este tiempo con el pensamiento crítico, sin pretensiones falsas de objetividad, pero sí con la rigurosidad y el trabajo que produce datos que permite una mirada compleja. Quiero cerrar con una frase de Stuart Hall a la que me gusta volver en estos tiempos. He vivido una vida académica y me he ganado la vida trabajando como académico. Amo enseñar, he querido enseñar desde que recuerdo. La enseñanza se lleva a cabo en los mundos académicos. Respeto y defiendo la academia hasta el fondo por la capacidad que tiene de transmitir el conocimiento a las generaciones futuras y de buscar el conocimiento sin otro propósito que este mismo. Uno debe defender esta arena de pensamiento crítico, sobre todo en estos días cuando está bajo el ataque desde tantos ámbitos con la vida misma de uno. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Amparo. Finalmente pasamos a la presentación de nuestro participante anónimo. Adelante.
Gracias. Quiero agradecer a todos por la invitación, a la Universidad de Columbia que nos acoge, a María Inclán, al CIDE y a todos mis colegas que compartimos este espacio de reflexión. Voy a subir una presentación. Perfecto. Voy a hablar del caso de Nicaragua para analizar las amenazas y desafíos a la libertad académica. Es importante para hacer este ejercicio contextualizar desde dónde estamos hablando la labor universitaria y cómo este contexto afecta la libertad académica. Primero mencionar que ha habido un proceso de regresión y deterioro de una frágil democracia. Este proceso de deterioro inició con el afán del control del poder horizontal por parte del Ejecutivo, en este caso el gobierno Ortega. Inició el control sobre el Consejo Supremo Electoral, sobre la Corte Suprema de Justicia, y eso le permitió tener el control de la Asamblea Legislativa. De esta manera, ir aprobando una serie de leyes inconstitucionales. El control de la Corte Suprema de Justicia le ha garantizado un régimen de impunidad y también una maquinaria represiva. Y el Consejo Supremo Electoral le ha permitido, lo que ustedes ven en pantalla, realmente extirpar la naturaleza competitiva del régimen electoral y convertirlo simplemente en un ejercicio o un remedio de elecciones. Y eso le ha permitido, si usted observa en las columnas oscuras, tener el control casi absoluto de la Asamblea Legislativa. También ha logrado tener el control del poder territorial, que es vertical, a través del control de las alcaldías o gobiernos locales, como se llama en Nicaragua, en las gráficas inferiores, ¿no? También otro eje que ha sido clave en este proceso de deterioro de la democracia ha sido la institucionalización de la violencia política. El gobierno ha ido, digamos, reprimiendo cualquier expresión de movilización social, ya sea campesina, contra el canal interoceánico, ya sea contra el modelo extractivo autoritario de comunidades indígenas o comunidades campesinas que se oponen a proyectos como represas, a proyectos como oligopólicos de turismo grande o el extractivismo minero. Asimismo, ha habido un proceso de ejecuciones selectivas contra el liderazgo campesino organizado del centro y norte del país. Campesinado que fue parte o base social de la resistencia en los años 80. Ahí tenemos la imagen de Tamara Dávila, una feminista luchadora que protestaba por el caso de Lea Valle, una mujer campesina que le asesinaron a sus hijos en la Cruz de Río Grande. Prácticamente con este control de los poderes del Estado, con el control territorial donde se implementan las organizaciones territoriales de control, el control de las alcaldías, se socava la autonomía municipal. Llegamos en abril a una dictadura que ha reprimido la insurrección cívica no violenta con violencia letal. Ustedes pueden ver a los estudiantes universitarios protestando pacíficamente en la avenida universitaria, y al otro cuadro están estudiantes universitarios que fueron encarcelados. Muchos de ellos fueron encarcelados varias veces. Ustedes pueden ver en esta imagen, sin muchas palabras, la desproporción del uso de la fuerza. Ustedes ven a jóvenes de pueblos, de Masaya y otras comunidades, que se enfrentaron con ondas o tiradoras o con morteros. En cambio, la policía y los grupos élites utilizaron armamento de calibre pesado. Es algo que ha sido comentado por organismos de derechos humanos nacionales e internacionales. Realmente se ha logrado establecer crímenes de lesa humanidad en la represión de abril. Obviamente esto significa la alteración del orden constitucional, la supresión del Estado de Derecho, y ha tenido un costo humano altísimo. Han habido más de 355 asesinatos, entre ellos 29 niños y niñas. Han habido más de 1.600 detenciones y secuestros, muchos de ellos han sido torturados. En pocos meses se dio la expulsión de más de 110.000 personas forzadas al exilio, principalmente a Costa Rica, Centroamérica, ahora Estados Unidos, España. Han habido más de 2000 personas heridas, muchos estudiantes quedaron lisiados, perdieron un ojo, tienen balas de proyectiles de AK en la cabeza o en las partes de su cuerpo. Actualmente hay más de 155 presos políticos. La cuarta parte de ellos son mayores de 50 años con enfermedades crónicas y están siendo sometidos a tratos crueles e inhumanos, interrogatorios continuos, aislamiento de sus familiares y celdas de aislamiento sin luz natural. Entre estos presos políticos tenemos a 5 estudiantes universitarios, algunos de ellos fueron reencarcelados, hay 5 académicos, hay 5 analistas políticos, algunos de ellos simplemente por omitir opinión pública ante los medios de comunicación han sido encarcelados, ¿verdad? Hay 4 periodistas también encarcelados. Muchos de ellos han sido condenados ya a 8 o 13 años de prisión bajo procesos judiciales viciados, acusados de terrorismo, de lavado de dinero, de ciberdelito, etcétera, ¿no? Ha habido la confiscación de 3 medios de comunicación, el canal 100% Noticias, la prensa y Confidencial. Hay más de 90 periodistas exiliados actualmente. Aquí tienen ustedes a la mamá de Max Jerez, doña Heidi. Ella pidió ver a su hijo antes de morir, su hijo único que está encarcelado actualmente, y no se le permitió ni siquiera ese derecho que merece cualquier ser humano, aunque esté encarcelado. Se han aprobado leyes que se llama Ley de Defensa del Pueblo, la Ley 1055, que es una ley con 2 decretos que puede amplia, que puede cometer cualquier tipo de abuso contra la ciudadanía. Hay una ley especial de ciberdelito. Bajo esta ley fue encarcelado y ha sido condenado un campesino que ni siquiera puede usar un teléfono inteligente, pero fue acusado de la ley ciberdelito. Y luego se reformó el Código Procesal Penal, donde digamos, la cárcel preventiva de 48 horas pasa a 90 días. Y ahí ustedes pueden ver la cantidad de presos políticos, hay líderes campesinos, hay ambientalistas, hay defensores de derechos humanos como María Oviedo, ahí está Félix Maradiaga, tenemos a Juan Sebastián Chamorro, al doctor Arturo Cruz, todos ellos son académicos, Arturo Cruz fue director del INCAE, Félix dirigía el Instituto de Estudio Estratégico, Juan Sebastián Chamorro era director de FUNIDES, y así hay una serie de personas que han sido, digamos, enjuiciadas y condenadas, ¿no? Abajo tenemos al señor Edgar Parrales, que por dar opinión y ser un analista fue encarcelado y ha sido sentenciado. Ha muerto presos políticos en las cárceles, como el general Hugo Torres, que ustedes lo ven en la esquina inferior, falleció en las condiciones de deterioro inhumanas, ¿no? Teniendo claro la crudeza de esta dictadura, el estado de indefensión en el que se encuentra la ciudadanía en general, periodistas, defensores y académicos, es importante señalar cuáles han sido, digamos, como las estrategias represivas del régimen, ¿no? Ha habido un desmantelamiento de la autonomía universitaria, hay un control político de los funcionarios, de las autoridades, han habido instituciones, han habido expulsiones de estudiantes de sus carreras que fueron identificados como líderes universitarios durante las protestas de abril. Ha habido una utilización de la dependencia financiera para asfixiar económicamente a las universidades, a algunos institutos, ¿verdad? Ha habido procesos administrativos viciados donde no se les permite ni se les recibe los trámites a algunas universidades privadas y también organizaciones sociales, y han sido, digamos, canceladas sus personalidades jurídicas. En estos primeros 3 meses han sido canceladas 5 universidades privadas y han sido confiscados sus bienes. Algunos de estos rectores se han visto obligados a exiliarse, como el caso de la Universidad Paulo Freire. Nuestro rector de la Universidad Centroamericana de UCA no se le ha permitido el ingreso al país. Se aprobó recientemente la reforma de la Ley General de Educación, la Ley de Autonomía de las Instituciones de Educación Superior. A la Universidad Centroamericana de UCA se le ha recortado durante los últimos 4 años más de 250 millones del presupuesto del 6% de las universidades. Este fue un derecho conquistado por la lucha de los estudiantes de escasos recursos que exigieron durante los años 90 que se respetara y se garantizara esta asignación presupuestaria para financiar becas y financiar, digamos, el derecho a la educación superior gratuita. Y la Universidad Centroamericana ha sido excluida con esta reciente ley aprobada. Hay ciertos desafíos, ¿verdad?, frente a esta situación tan adversa. Ha habido un esfuerzo por adaptar y mantener la labor investigativa en situaciones muy difíciles. Se ha tratado de priorizar la integridad de las personas, tanto los quienes investigamos, como también con quienes hacemos la investigación. Resguardar la seguridad y la protección de las personas, de los informantes o los sujetos de la investigación. Se han definido colectivamente protocolos para poder trabajar en este contexto y se ha priorizado el autocuidado de las personas, porque sabemos que ante esta situación incierta y ante estas amenazas sostenidas, hay que mantener una resistencia corresponsable y ser resiliente en este contexto. Se ha tratado de fortalecer la colaboración investigativa entre los distintos centros, institutos y algunos académicos. Hemos tratado de fortalecer nuestra vinculación a nivel regional. Nosotros nos hemos articulado más fuertemente con algunas universidades de Centroamérica, la Universidad Jesuita, la Landívar, la UCA El Salvador, con espacios de investigación como el ERIC en Honduras, la Universidad de Costa Rica, por ejemplo. También hemos tratado de promover espacios de solidaridad entre nosotros. Hemos tratado de articular agendas regionales de investigación. Estamos trabajando en AUJAL con el desencanto de la democracia, se trabajó hace poco, y ahora estamos trabajando en un observatorio sobre la democracia en América Latina. También estamos construyendo un programa de investigación sobre democracia en Centroamérica. En fin, ha habido un esfuerzo de establecer vínculos de colaboración, pero también mantener el trabajo investigativo. Sabemos que la libertad académica potencia, despierta y dinamiza la conciencia crítica, inspira la solidaridad, el anhelo de justicia en la sociedad, interpela y exige rendición de cuentas de los poderes. También activa nuevas formas sociales y políticas de transformar situaciones de injusticia y desigualdad. Hace unos días se les prohibió entrar al país al doctor Carlos Sandoval, que muchos conocen como investigador de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Él venía a hacer trabajo de campo y se le impidió entrar al país. O sea que no solamente ha habido una hostilidad hacia la Academia Nacional, sino también hacia otros investigadores que quieran entrar al país y colaborar, digamos. Voy a leer solamente para terminar este espacio una frase de Ignacio de Coria, pues su último discurso cuando recibió el premio en Barcelona, y él dice: la universidad debe pretender ser libre y objetiva, pero la objetividad y la libertad pueden exigir ser parciales, y nosotros somos libremente parciales a favor de las mayorías populares, de las víctimas, porque son injustamente oprimidas y porque en ellas negativa y positivamente está la verdad de la realidad. Nosotros vamos a cumplir 4 años de esta crisis y quiero leer un poema que escribí en abril hace 4 años y que considero que tiene vigencia. Este poema está dedicado a los familiares que han perdido a sus seres queridos, muchas madres y padres que perdieron a sus hijos que eran estudiantes universitarios o jóvenes de barrios y de comunidades campesinas, pero también se lo estoy dedicando a muchos familiares, esposas, padres, madres, hijos y hijas, niños que están privados de ese contacto humano de sus seres queridos. Amor mío, hijo mío, pueblo mío, te ofrezco esta esperanza herida, cuyos latidos se desangran en la mirada desaliñada de esas madres, de esos padres que lloran silenciosamente la ausencia de sus hijos e hijas, cuyos huesos rotos sufren el frío de esa presencia arrebatada, de ese amargo y oscuro silencio que gotea cada noche, sin la posibilidad de besarlos y arrebatarles una caricia, de las imposibles formas de abrazarlos en el pasillo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Yo había planeado algunas preguntas de discusión para los panelistas y simplemente las voy a presentar a forma de invitación a los demás, a los que están atendiendo este evento para que se animen a presentar preguntas a los panelistas, ya que todavía tenemos 15 minutos de este evento. Oyendo estas presentaciones, vemos que pasamos de contextos en donde las amenazas a la academia comienzan a ser las primeras señales de posible retroceso democrático a contextos mucho más violentos en los cuales los ataques a los académicos son precisamente por denunciar crímenes que las autoridades están cometiendo ya. Entonces yo simplemente quisiera cuestionar el hecho de que si las autoridades son capaces de imponer su ideología sobre la educación y las instituciones académicas, y son capaces de violar sus propias reglas, ¿no? Como en el caso de la Universidad de Florida o lo estamos viendo en los casos en México. ¿Cómo podemos ver o concebir comunidades académicas que puedan ser capaces de contribuir y construir al refuerzo y a la socialización del Estado de Derecho, ¿no? Que son tan necesarias en una democracia si son precisamente las mismas autoridades las que las violan? Es solamente un pensamiento, ¿no? Y quisiera invitar a los que están escuchando, a nuestra audiencia, a unirse a nuestra conversación con preguntas. O si los mismos participantes del panel quisieran, tenemos ya una, participar. No la veo. ¿Por qué no puedo ver la pregunta?
Maria?
Yes.
I think I have my audio back, but these are such heart-wrenching stories, and they are really important for those of us in the United States who, as I said, take academic freedom for granted to hear, because the slope of authoritarianism is always present, and that sliding where we who are relatively comfortable in the United States have gone through these periods ourselves, but it's very easy to forget them, whether it's McCarthyism and the Cold War or other types of crackdowns that we've seen on both the right and the left. These are present not only in the United States, but we really see them in places like Mexico and El Salvador and Nicaragua. And we in the Academy need to hear this from you. It's so important to hear the voices of those who are on the front lines, because it's very easiest for us to just say, oh, this is just a one-off. We are not seeing the same level of oppression and death and fear in Florida, much less the rest of the United States. But it creeps slowly, this authoritarianism. Just this week, we were asked by our provost, along with every other college and university professor who is employed by the state of Florida, to fill out the very Orwellian sounding intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity employee survey. Now, we were asked, we weren't compelled. It's supposedly anonymous, but who knows? And again, I am not filling that survey out. I thought about satisficing and replying in ways that I thought that the governor who signed House Bill 233 into law last year that caused this to go into action, of what he would want to hear, so that perhaps we needed more diversity on the faculty if they were all in line with his thinking. But
I decided to avoid it out of principle. That is none of my government's. They have no need to know what I and my colleagues think. They should evaluate us on our scholarship, on our teaching, on our service to the public at public universities. But I want to just come back to the point that please keep speaking out. We need to hear your voices. We need to have more forums like this in order to realize that what we're seeing in Florida is part of that same continuum, and be ever mindful of where it leads. So again, thank you so much for including me in this panel.
Thank you, Dan. We have a question from an anonymous attendee that says, considerando la primera intervención que refería a procesos judiciales en curso, me pregunto si los panelistas consideran viable una acción judicial conjunta, tal vez hasta ante instancias internacionales, como una forma de presionar a autoridades nacionales. ¿Cómo se podría hacer? ¿Qué podríamos esperar de tales estrategias? ¿A qué se refiere de parte de la organización de la academia en cada país para lograr mayor resonancia? ¿Alguien quisiera responder o responder a los comentarios de Dan o a las presentaciones? Sí, Kath.
Sí, yo creo que para responder a la pregunta en el chat, una posibilidad que se abre a través de la reciente aprobación de los principios de libertad académica en la Comisión Internacional de Derechos Humanos es precisamente acciones judiciales en foros internacionales como la Comisión para intentar defender los académicos en los espacios americanos, ¿no?, que están cubiertos por esa comisión, para intentar hacer valer los derechos. Ahora bien, es una posibilidad, pero dado la actitud hostil que tiene tanto los presidentes Bukele, Noriega y López Obrador frente a la intervención de externos, ¿no?, y la propensidad con que se señala esa intervención como ser pagado por intereses privados, ¿no?, hay que pensar que esos intentos también pueden ser contraproducentes. Entonces, pues ahí ya está la posibilidad, pero uno tiene que estar consciente de que la situación en países como los nuestros ya no es receptiva a la intervención extranjera, ¿no? Y la búsqueda de trabajar en conjunto frente a cortes internacionales.
Gracias, Kath. Tenemos otra pregunta que dice, do you think academics should stay out of politics and should academics refrain from using the academia to do political and ideological activism and indoctrination?
Yeah, I think it is very important for academics on the left or the right to be able to speak out, to be able to speak truth to power. When I serve as an expert, I am regularly criticized by experts that the state of Florida hires. And we let the court determine whose interpretation is the one that the judge is going to be ruling on. It's very important. In fact, it reminds me of very recently when our Florida Board of Governors, which is part and parcel of the problem, as well as our Board of Trustees regulating the University of Florida, of cracking down on the three of us. We know where it's coming from. We've heard the president of the Board of Trustees say, this will not stand when it comes to University of Florida faculty speaking out on issues that run against the interests of the state. They held a event, their annual event in South Florida in December, I believe it was. And they invited a very prominent conservative who has actually been inviting conservatives who have been banned from liberal campuses. Robert George is his name. He's a professor at Princeton and has his own institute. And he's been inviting them as a forum when they have been doxxed or silenced from the left. Well, the University of Florida and the Board of Trustees and the Board of Governors invited this Professor George to their event. I'm sure thinking that he was going to speak out against liberals in the academy. And in fact, he didn't do that at all. He spoke out how important it was for people who are progressives, who differ with him and his ideology, to be able to have a platform to speak the truth. And I think it shocked the Board of Governors. It put them in their place. And I applaud Professor George for speaking out, because this shouldn't have anything to do with your political ideology. It should have to do with your ability to profess in your area of expertise and be able to, certainly if you're a state employee, be able to work on behalf of the people who are paying your salary, the taxpayers of Florida, not the governor and not the governor's ideology, not the Board of Governors or the Board of Trustees, not the president or the provost. Speak out and be able to be protected in terms of not having prior restraint and be restricted on your ability to speak. And again, I think you need to have 1,000 flowers bloom, and what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So again, it's easy to say that when it's assumed that's how it works. It's much more difficult when you start to see that encroaching authoritarianism that is silencing one side versus the other.
May I say something, Maria?
Sure, very quickly, as we need to close.
I just want to say that as a professional teacher, there is a difference between teaching and indoctrination. Teaching aims to open the student's mind and force him or her to consider different answers to the questions being addressed in the classroom. It encourages intellectual curiosity, that is to say, to go and research the answers to the questions yourself. I think it's very, very, very dangerous to try and portray academic activity as an activity of indoctrination. And I think it is a common feature of all authoritarian regimes to attempt to portray academic activity as a form of political indoctrination. The reason why authoritarian regimes use this terminology is because they object precisely to this activity of critical thought. They do not wish to have their ideas questioned, and they do not wish to let young people or any kind of people make up their own minds about political, social, economic, or religious questions. And academics, what we want, I would say, I would speak for 99% of all academics, is that students make up their own minds. And this is why listening to all sides is absolutely necessary, and silencing and deplatforming any different view is extremely dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Kath. And with that, we will have to close, only because we ran out of time, not out of questions or not any interest in silencing anybody. Thank you, Nara. Thank you, Semeka. Thank you, ILAS. Thank you, Columbia University, for giving us this space. And thank you, Amparo. our anonymous participant, Kath and Dan, for sharing their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Thank you.